I'm a 30-year-old guy, and for the past decade, I've had no contact with my parents. No calls, no messages, nothing. I cut them off completely, and for good reason. Growing up, my parents controlled everything. What I wore, what I ate, what hobbies I was allowed to have, it all had to fit within their expectations. They had my entire future mapped out before I even hit high school. I was going to study business, take over my father's company, marry someone they approved of, and live a life they considered successful. There was never a conversation, just orders. I didn't get a say in my own life. By the time I was a teenager, I started pushing back. I wanted to pursue a career in tech, not business. That was unacceptable to them. My mother cried about how I was ruining my future. My father yelled that I was throwing away everything they built for me. I got lectures, punishments, and silent treatments anytime I showed a shred of independence. But the real breaking point came when I was 20. I got accepted into a top university for computer science. I was excited, but when I told my parents, they lost it. My father told me to decline the offer and reapply to a business school. My mother tried to guilt trip me, saying I was abandoning the family. When I stood firm and refused to back down, they gave me an ultimatum: follow their path or leave. So I left. I walked out with just a backpack and the little money I had saved. I crashed on a friend's couch for a few months, worked part-time jobs to support myself, and focused on school. I thought maybe, with time, they'd come around, but instead they doubled down. They told relatives I was ungrateful and brainwashed. Any attempt at reconciliation was just them trying to regain control. When they realized I wasn't coming back, they wrote me off completely. At first, some of my extended family stayed in touch, but over the years that changed. One by one, people stopped responding to my messages. It wasn't until a few years later that I found out why. I was at a coffee shop when an old childhood friend ran into me. They looked like they had seen a ghost. That's when they told me my parents had spread the story that I had died in a private accident, and even held a small closed-off memorial. They never gave details, which explained why no one ever saw an obituary or funeral announcement. According to them, I had been in some tragic accident. They never gave details, just enough to make it sound convincing. It explained why relatives stopped talking to me. They actually thought I was gone. I didn't know whether to be angry or just disturbed. Who lies about something like that? For a second, I considered confronting them, exposing their lie to everyone. But then I thought, why bother? They were out of my life, and I wanted to keep it that way. So I let it go. I focused on my own life and the people who actually cared about me. And that's when I met Sarah. Sarah, 28 Pfeff, came into my life when I was least expecting it. She was kind, understanding, and most importantly, she never judged me for my past. She knew about my parents, and while she encouraged me to heal, she never pushed me to reconnect. We built a life together, and 5 years later, I proposed. She said yes. We planned a small wedding, just close friends and the few family members I still trusted. My parents weren't invited. In fact, I took every precaution to keep it private. The guest list was tight, and no one with direct ties to them was included. At least that's what I thought. Later, I found out that one of my distant relatives, who I hadn't considered a risk, had casually mentioned it to another family member, who then told my parents. It only took one slip for them to find out, or so I thought. The day of the wedding arrived, and everything was perfect. The venue was beautiful. Sarah looked stunning, and we were surrounded by people who truly cared about us. It felt like the fresh start I had been working towards for years. And then, just as we were about to exchange vows, the doors burst open. At first, I didn't even recognize them. My mother and father stood there, dressed in full mourning black, my mother clutching a handkerchief like she was attending a funeral. She let out this loud, dramatic sob and collapsed against my father, who shook his head in disbelief. The entire room went silent. People turned to look at them, confused, trying to figure out what was happening. My mother let out another exaggerated wail before locking eyes with me. "Oh my God," she cried. "Our baby. You're alive." She staggered forward like she was in a soap opera, arms outstretched like she was about to throw herself at me. My father stood behind her, shaking his head, muttering about how it was a miracle. The realization hit me like a brick. They were keeping up the lie. The same one they had told for years. They had spent nearly a decade telling everyone I was dead, and now they were acting like they had just discovered I had come back to life right in the middle of my wedding. My fiancée gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my palm, but she stayed calm. I could hear whispers among the guests, some horrified, others confused. A few of my more distant relatives were looking at me like they had just seen a ghost. My grandparents, one of the only family members I still had contact with, were the first to react. My grandmother stood up, her face red with anger, and demanded they leave. My grandfather called them out on their lies right there in front of everyone. But my parents weren't going to go quietly. My mother clutched her chest like she was about to faint. "We thought we lost you forever," she sobbed. "We just wanted to see you one last time." I barely had time to react before they turned their attention to Sarah. My mother's expression twisted into something ugly as she pointed at her. "You," she hissed. "You took him from us. You brainwashed him." Sarah's grip on my hand tightened, but she held her ground. I could see the frustration flicker in her eyes, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Now, she said. He's just better off without you. The whole room tensed. My parents had never been called out so directly before, and it showed. My father clenched his jaw, his face turning red. My mother's lip trembled, like she was waiting for me to step in and defend her. I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, and without raising my voice, told them to leave. For the first time in my life, I had complete control of the situation, and I wasn't going to let them ruin it. They refused to move. My mother started crying again. My father stood his ground, and the guests didn't know what to do. But then, before things could escalate even further, the venue staff stepped in. Security was called, and just like that, my parents, the people who had lied about my death, who had tried to manipulate me for years, were escorted out of my wedding, screaming about their dead son coming back to life. The moment security stepped in, the entire room seemed frozen in shock. My mother was still sobbing, clutching at her chest like she was on the verge of collapsing, while my father stood stiffly beside her, shaking his head in disbelief. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to process what was happening. Some of my extended family, people I hadn't spoken to in years, looked genuinely horrified. They had believed the lie, they had mourned me, and now, here I was very much alive, standing at my own wedding, while my parents put on a full-blown theatrical performance. My mother suddenly let out another wail and tried to rush toward me. One of the security guards stepped in her path just in time. She recoiled like she had been physically struck, staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes before looking back at me. Our baby. You're alive. Her voice was shrill, shaking, like she was barely holding herself together. She turned toward the guests now, hands raised in desperation. You don't understand. We thought he was dead. For years, we lost him. And now he's here. And no one told us. She choked out another sob and grabbed my father's arm for support. My father, ever the dramatist in his own way, placed a hand over his chest and exhaled shakily, like he was struggling to stay upright. Sarah, standing beside me, didn't move an inch. Her fingers were still wrapped tightly around mine. If she was shaken by the spectacle, she didn't show it. Meanwhile, my grandparents had had enough. My grandmother stepped forward, face red with anger, and pointed directly at my parents. You need to leave. Now, my grandfather, standing beside her, didn't even bother raising his voice. You're making a scene. This is not the time or place. For a second, it seemed like my parents would listen. But then my mother turned to them, eyes wide and pleading. How can you say that? How can you? He's your grandson. We lost him. We thought he was gone forever. My grandmother didn't even blink. You told people he was gone. You did this. That was the moment the whispers among the guests turned into quiet murmurs of realization. I could see a few of my distant relatives, people I had once been close to, glancing at each other with expressions of shock and discomfort. They had believed my parents. They had grieved, and now they were realizing they had been manipulated. But my parents weren't going to give up that easily. My father stepped forward now, putting on the same solemn, disappointed expression I had seen 1,000 times before. We didn't know, he said. We had no idea you were alive. If we had known, he let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head like this was all some tragic misunderstanding. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just stared at him. Sarah finally spoke. You knew. Her voice was calm, steady. My mother snapped her head toward her, eyes narrowing, all traces of grief momentarily replaced with something colder. You, she spat. You took him from us. Her hand shot out, finger pointing directly at Sarah. You're the reason he cut us off. You poisoned him against us. Her voice cracked, breath hitching, her entire body shaking with rage now. You brainwashed him. A few guests gasped. Others pulled out their phones. The moment people started recording, I knew there was no coming back from this. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't get angry. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, and in the same calm tone, said, No, he's just better off without you. The room went dead silent. My mother's entire body tensed. Her lips trembled. Her face twisted into something between shock and fury. My father's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. They had lost control of the situation, and they knew it. I took a step forward then, keeping my voice even. You need to leave. My mother let out a choked, disbelieving laugh. You're choosing her over your own family? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The answer was obvious. One of the security guards stepped closer. Sir, ma'am, you need to exit the venue. My mother's expression crumbled. Her knees buckled, and she staggered slightly, pressing a hand to her forehead like she was about to faint. My father caught her, shaking his head at me like I had personally shattered their entire world. You were dead to us, he muttered under his breath. The words were barely audible, but I caught them. And then, just like that, the security guards stepped in, guiding them toward the exit. My mother sobbed all the way to the doors, calling out my name between wails. My father stayed stiff and silent, jaw clenched, as he let himself be led away. The second the doors shut behind them, the tension in the room broke. People started murmuring, shifting awkwardly in their seats. A few guests were still holding up their phones, staring at their screens in disbelief. Some of my relatives turned to me, eyes wide with a mix of guilt and shock. Sarah gave my hand a small squeeze. I took a deep breath, and then, without missing a beat, I turned back to the officiant and said, "Let's continue." There was a pause, just a brief moment of hesitation, and then a few people in the audience let out quiet laughs, shaking their heads like they couldn't believe what had just happened. Someone clapped. Another person whispered, "That was insane." And then, just like that, the ceremony continued. But I knew, even as we said our vows, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The wedding should have ended with celebration. Instead, it turned into a viral disaster. By the next day, clips of my parents' dramatic stunt started making rounds online. Some guests had recorded the scene and shared it with friends, who then shared it again. Before long, extended family and even strangers had seen the chaos unfold. Guests had recorded everything. The moment they burst in, my mother's wailing, my father clutching his chest like he was having a spiritual awakening, and security dragging them out as they screamed about their dead son coming back to life. By the time Sarah and I reached the reception venue, my phone was already lighting up with notifications. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly messaging me. Some were confused, demanding answers. Others were apologetic, realizing now that they had been lied to. One text read, "I can't believe it. We actually held a memorial for you." Another simply said, "We're so sorry, but not everyone was on my side." A few messages took a different tone. "They're your parents. They were grieving. Can you really blame them for being overwhelmed?" Someone else told me I was cold for letting security throw them out. Then came the worst of it. Screenshots of a Facebook post from my mother. She had wasted no time spinning her own version of events. The post was long, overly emotional, and full of outright lies. "For years, we thought our son was gone forever. We mourned him. We cried for him. Imagine our joy, our miracle, when we learned he was alive, only to find out he wants nothing to do with us. He has been brainwashed by a woman who has turned him against his own flesh and blood. He is lost to us again, but this time, it is even worse, because he chose to abandon his parents. A parent's worst nightmare come true. We only wanted to see him one last time before he was stolen away forever." The comments were exactly what I expected. A mix of sympathy and outrage. Some people ate it up. "Oh my God, I can't believe he would do that to you." Others weren't so convinced. "Wait, you told people he was dead?" One person even linked the wedding clip with a caption that said, "This is the grief you were talking about." The post was getting traction fast. That was when the real blast from the past started. Old classmates, former coworkers, people I hadn't spoken to since college were suddenly reaching out. Some were just confused, but a few of them had actually believed I had died. One former friend messaged me, "Dude, I literally cried when I heard what happened to you. Now I find out it was all fake. Your parents are insane." Sarah and I were barely halfway through dinner at our reception when my grandparents pulled me aside. They weren't just upset, they were furious. Without hesitation, they made their own post, calling out my parents for lying and making it clear to everyone what really happened. My grandfather wrote, "Our grandson has been alive and well this whole time. His parents fabricated his death to control the family narrative. The moment he moved on with his life, they tried to drag him back through manipulation. We will no longer support these lies." It didn't take long before the rest of the family started choosing sides. Some relatives openly condemned my parents, horrified that they had spread such a lie for so long. A few of my cousins even reached out to apologize. "We should have questioned it. We just believed what they told us." But there were still some who were trying to guilt me into forgiving them. "They're still your parents. You should at least hear them out." I ignored all of it. Sarah and I focused on celebrating with the people who actually mattered. We danced, we laughed, and we had a great night. By the time we left, I was exhausted, but I was determined to put it behind me. Then another message came in. An uncle I barely kept in contact with warned me that my parents were now threatening to sue for emotional distress. At first I almost laughed, until I got a letter from a lawyer they had actually hired. It was clear they were trying to scare me into meeting them. I consulted my own lawyer, who assured me that their case was baseless, and that any attempt to move forward with legal action would be dismissed immediately. My parents were really going all in on this victim act, but it didn't stop there. 2 days later, we were in our hotel room on our honeymoon when the front desk called. Security had been alerted. My parents had shown up at the resort, demanding to see me. I had no idea how they found us, until I remembered that I had booked the trip using a travel agency. It turns out they had impersonated me over the phone, claiming they had a family emergency, and convinced an employee to confirm my reservation. The resort apologized profusely and assured us that security would handle it. They refused to leave, insisting that this was a life or death matter. I didn't even have to ask who it was. Sarah and I told security under no circumstances should they be allowed near us. Hotel staff handled it, but the fact that they had tracked us down was disturbing. That was when Sarah brought up the idea of a restraining order. This wasn't just an embarrassing stunt anymore. It was harassment. They had already shown up at the wedding uninvited, tried to turn my family against me, and now they were attempting one last desperate stunt by crashing my honeymoon. Their persistence was unrelenting. But this time, it was clear they were running out of ways to manipulate the situation. It was clear they weren't going to stop. By the time we got home, we had already made up our minds. This wasn't over, but now we were going to fight back. The honeymoon should have been the one place where we could finally breathe. After the wedding chaos, after my parents' public meltdown, after all the messages from confused relatives, Sarah and I had been looking forward to just shutting out the world for a while. That lasted 2 days. We were lounging in our hotel room when the call came from the front desk. Hotel security was requesting to speak with me. My parents were outside. They had somehow tracked us down and were now standing in the hotel lobby demanding to see me. According to the staff, my mother was crying, insisting that it was a life or death situation. My father was talking to anyone who would listen, saying that their long-lost son had been manipulated into cutting them off. We didn't even go downstairs. I told the staff immediately, "Do not let them up." Security tried reasoning with them. My parents refused to leave. They kept making a scene, insisting that this was a family emergency and that they had the right to talk to me. They even started calling Sarah the woman who stole our son to anyone who would listen. When it became clear that they weren't going to leave voluntarily, I told the hotel staff to call the police. It took 15 minutes for the officers to arrive. I watched from the security cameras in the lobby as my parents immediately switched tactics. The moment they saw the officers, my mother went full victim mode. She grabbed onto one of the officer's arms, sobbing dramatically. "You have to help us. Our son is missing. He's been brainwashed. He's in danger." My father, ever the calculated one, stepped in with a solemn nod, adding just enough weight to make it sound believable. "He's been kidnapped. We just need to make sure he's okay." I almost laughed at how fast they turned me into the missing person. The officers asked them for proof. That's when my mother whipped out a wedding photo. Yes, a photo from my own wedding, pointing at Sarah and saying, "She's the one who took him from us." The officers, to their credit, didn't buy it for a second. One of them asked, "So you're telling me your kidnapped son managed to have a full wedding ceremony, and multiple guests were there to witness it, but no one thought to call the police?" The hotel staff backed me up immediately, confirming that Sarah and I were here on our honeymoon, and that I had already told them not to let my parents in. The officers asked to speak with me directly, so I went downstairs. The moment I appeared, my mother gasped like she had just seen a ghost and started running toward me. She barely got 2 steps in before security stepped in front of her. I kept my voice level. "I told you to leave me alone." My father let out a slow, measured sigh, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. "You've really changed, son, choosing strangers over your own family." I didn't respond. The officers pulled them aside, making it clear they were trespassing. This was their only warning. If they tried contacting me again, they would face legal consequences. My mother made one last desperate plea. Just one meeting, one dinner. "Please." When I didn't respond, she turned to Sarah. "Are you really going to take him away from his own mother?" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even look at her. She just looked at me and said, "Let's go." The officers escorted my parents out of the hotel. As they were leaving, my father muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "You'll regret this. One day we'll be gone, and you'll regret every second." My mother sobbed dramatically, calling out, "We'll always love you." The second they were out of sight, the staff assured us that our room would be flagged for extra security. They even comped part of our stay for the inconvenience. But I knew this wasn't over. By the time we got back to our room, my phone was already flooded with more messages. Word had spread. Some family members were horrified. Others thought I had taken things too far by calling the police. My grandparents, however, weren't having it. Within an hour, my grandfather had sent a group message to the extended family. "This ends now. If you support what they did today, you are no longer welcome in our lives. They have harassed, manipulated, and embarrassed themselves beyond repair. They are no longer family to us." I got a few private messages from cousins who had believed the original death story. Some apologized. Others wanted more details. But the real twist came when I checked my email. A single message. No sender name. No subject. Just one sentence. "Please, just meet us once before we leave for good." It was clearly my parents, and it meant only one thing. They weren't done yet. Sarah and I didn't even hesitate. We started the process for a restraining order the very next day. The email was the final straw. The wording was vague, but the intent was obvious. My parents weren't done. They were going to keep pushing, keep manipulating, until they got what they wanted. So Sarah and I went ahead with the restraining order. We gathered everything: security footage from the wedding, the hotel's records of them trespassing, the messages and emails they sent. It was enough to prove a clear pattern of harassment. But before the legal system could even process the paperwork, my parents escalated things again. This time, they took it public. It started with a Facebook post, a long dramatic rant from my mother's account, complete with multiple crying emojis, a black and white photo of me from when I was a kid, and a caption that read, "Our beautiful son was stolen from us." Twice. The post itself was insane. She painted this entire story where I had been brainwashed by Sarah, manipulated into abandoning my loving family, and cruelly rejecting their attempts to reconnect. She described our wedding as a tragic moment where they discovered I was alive, only to be violently thrown out like garbage. She didn't stop there. She went on to say that they had no choice but to tell people I was dead, because I had forced their hand by cutting off contact. Apparently, my silence had driven them to such an extreme measure. It didn't take long for the post to explode. Within hours, old family members, acquaintances, even strangers were reacting. Some people were confused. Others were furious. Then came the real kicker. Comments from people who had genuinely thought I was dead. "Wait, he's alive. We had a whole memorial for him. I can't believe I believed this for years. What is wrong with you? I sent you flowers when I heard he was gone. Are you kidding me?" At first, my parents tried to keep up the act, playing the devastated, grieving parents who had been betrayed. But the more people started questioning their version of events, the more their story started unraveling. That's when my grandparents stepped in. My grandfather, the same one who had already called them out in the family group chat, made his own public post. It was short, direct. No theatrics. For anyone confused, my name was never dead. His parents spread that lie because they couldn't control him anymore. Now they're embarrassed they got caught. End of story. That was all it took for the floodgates to open. People started turning against my parents. Some were furious that they had lied about something so serious. Others were just embarrassed that they had been tricked. But my parents weren't going to go down quietly. They doubled down, insisting that they were the victims in all of this, that they had no choice but to lie, because I had abandoned them, that I was ungrateful, heartless, and cruel for shutting them out. Then, just when I thought they couldn't sink any lower, they started a GoFundMe. The title? Healing After Losing Our Son Twice. The description was filled with nonsense about how they needed therapy and legal support after everything they had been through. It barely lasted 24 hours before people tore it apart. The comment section was brutal. "This is a scam. You literally faked your son's death for sympathy. Get help. I'm reporting this to GoFundMe. You're disgusting." It didn't take long before the fundraiser was shut down for violating platform policies. At this point, I thought maybe this would be the wake-up call, that they would finally stop. But they weren't done yet. Next, they went after Sarah's parents. Somehow, they got their contact information and tried reaching out. They framed it as a concerned plea, claiming that Sarah was the reason I had turned against them, that she had isolated me from my real family. They begged for a meeting. Sarah's parents weren't having it. They shut it down immediately, refusing to entertain any of it. Sarah's father even sent a single reply: "Do not contact us again." That was it. No discussion. No back and forth. At that point, we had enough evidence to finalize the restraining order. The paperwork was submitted, and soon they would be served. But something told me this wasn't over. Not yet. The restraining order was approved faster than expected. The judge granted a temporary restraining order almost immediately, given the mountain of evidence we had: security footage, social media harassment, messages, and their attempts to track us down. The final hearing would decide if it would become permanent, but for now, they were legally required to stay away. They didn't take it well. Within hours of being served, my mother posted another dramatic rant. This time, she didn't hold back. "After everything we've been through, our own son has turned against us. A piece of paper means nothing. We raised him, we loved him, and now he's treating us like criminals. Heartless, ungrateful, brainwashed." The comment section was a mess. Some of their usual enablers were still defending them. Others had completely turned on them, calling them out for refusing to take accountability. One person even replied, "Didn't you literally fake his death?" This is insane. They weren't getting the reaction they wanted, so they tried a different approach, going through other people. Suddenly, some of my old friends and distant relatives were reaching out. Messages poured in. Some were neutral, just confused, and asking what was going on. Others were clearly being used as messengers. "Your parents are devastated. They just want to talk. They're hurting. Can't you just meet them once? They said they don't understand what they did wrong." It was obvious they were trying to bypass the restraining order by using mutual connections. But then came the real betrayal. A cousin, someone I thought I could trust, gave my parents my new address. I found out when my doorbell started ringing non-stop. Sarah and I were home when it happened. At first we thought it was a delivery. The restraining order was approved faster than expected. The judge granted a temporary restraining order almost immediately, given the mountain of evidence we had: security footage, social media harassment, messages, and their attempts to track us down. It didn't take long to figure out how they found me. When I confronted my cousin later, they admitted that they had casually mentioned my neighborhood in conversation with another relative. That relative, still loyal to my parents, put the pieces together and handed them my full address. She started pleading through the door. "Just let us in. We need to talk. Please, please, just 5 minutes." Then my father, who had been silent this entire time, slammed his fist against the door. "Open this damn door. Now." That was all I needed to hear. I immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, my parents were still outside, shouting at the door. The moment they saw law enforcement, my mother collapsed into full sobs, trying to play the victim. We're just desperate parents. We don't understand what we did wrong. The officers weren't buying it. They reminded them about the restraining order. They were officially trespassing, and if they didn't leave immediately, they could face legal consequences. My father, realizing they were out of options, grabbed my mother's arm and dragged her away, but not before throwing out one final guilt trip. One day, you'll regret this. You'll be alone, and we won't be there for you. The door slammed shut. They were gone. But there was one more loose end to tie up. I called the cousin who leaked our address. At first they denied it, but when I told them I knew the truth, they changed their story. I didn't think it was a big deal. They said they just wanted closure. I was just trying to help. It didn't matter. They were cut off. Permanently. After that, my parents made one last desperate attempt at controlling the narrative. Another Facebook post. This time, it was short. Our son has been stolen from us forever. We have lost him for good. This is our goodbye. No one believed them. People mocked them in the comments. Others called them out. Some family members, who had previously been neutral, finally saw how manipulative they were being, and cut them off too. One aunt even commented, "You did this to yourself." And just like that, their support network crumbled. After years of manipulation, lies, and public humiliation, they had no one left. Sarah and I changed our numbers, upgraded our home security, blocked anyone who tried to act as a messenger. For the first time in years, there was silence. Real, actual peace. And this time, we were never looking back. The silence didn't last long. A week after the home invasion attempt, my lawyer confirmed that my parents had been officially served with a notice for violating the restraining order. They now had a court date and were facing real legal consequences. Predictably, they didn't take it well. The same day they were served, my cousin, the one who gave them my address, sent a pathetic excuse of a message. I didn't think it was a big deal. They just wanted to talk. You could have just let them in. It was unbelievable. They had put my safety at risk. All because they thought my parents' sob story was more important than the actual restraining order. There was nothing left to say. I blocked them. Permanently. At this point, there was no one left defending my parents except a handful of enablers who still refused to accept reality. The rest of the family, they were finally waking up. I started getting apology messages from relatives who had originally sided with my parents. I had no idea they were this bad. We really thought they were just heartbroken parents. I'm so sorry for believing them. Even some of my older aunts and uncles, the ones who had kept their distance, finally admitted they had been lied to for years, but none of that mattered now. The damage was done. Then came the court date. My parents showed up looking pathetic. My mother wore all black, as if she was attending a funeral. My father walked in with his usual disappointed expression, like he was about to give a speech on how I had failed them. Their lawyer tried to spin the narrative. They weren't harassing me, they were just desperate parents who wanted to make peace. They didn't know they were violating a legal order. They only showed up because they were worried about my well-being. The judge didn't buy a single word of it. He cut through their excuses immediately. You were served with a legal order. You knew the terms. You ignored them. It was that simple. They got a formal warning. If they violated the order one more time, they would face actual jail time. But that wasn't the only consequence. The judge escalated the restraining order, extending it and making it even stricter. No contact, no messages, no third-party communication, no loopholes, and if they ever came near my home again, automatic arrest. My parents left the courtroom in silence. My mother had stopped pretending to cry. My father didn't even look at me. It was finally sinking in. But they weren't done yet. That same week, Sarah's parents got another unwanted contact attempt. A letter showed up at their house. It was handwritten, pages long, begging them to talk some sense into Sarah and help reunite our broken family. Sarah's parents didn't even read the whole thing. They shredded it and immediately installed security cameras. Then came the final blow to their online grift. Their GoFundMe scam. It got taken down. After being mass reported for fraud, the platform removed it completely. No more fake therapy money. No more donations. No more sympathy. That should have been the end of it. But they had one last stunt to pull. They tried to attack my job. I got called into a private meeting with my boss. He had a stack of printed emails, anonymous complaints. They accused me of fraud, workplace misconduct, and even endangering employees. It was all fabricated. My boss, he wasn't an idiot. He handed me the papers, shook his head and said, "Do you want to press charges?" I laughed. It wasn't even worth it. He assured me that my job was secure, and that nothing they said would change that. That was it. Their last move. They had no power left. No control, no support, no sympathy, and I never had to deal with them again. I thought the legal battle would be the end of it. The restraining order was in place. Their GoFundMe scam was shut down. They failed to get me fired, and most of the family had already cut them off. But instead of backing down, my parents went nuclear. Their final meltdown started the only way it could, with another unhinged Facebook rant. This time, they didn't just cry about losing me. They went full conspiracy mode. The post was pages long and filled with delusional claims. According to them, Sarah had brainwashed me into cutting them off. I had joined a cult that forced me to abandon my loving parents. The court system was corrupt and biased against them. The entire family had betrayed them by choosing the lies over the truth. They even tagged distant relatives, trying to pull more people into their mess. It didn't work. Instead of sympathy, the comments section turned against them. A cult? Really? Just take the L and move on. You told people he was dead, and now you're blaming his wife? Yikes. This is embarrassing. Seek help. It got so bad that my maternal grandparents stepped in. My grandfather posted a public response calling them liars. He laid it out clearly. They had spread the fake death story for years. They had been harassing me since my wedding. They had been caught trespassing, and were now facing legal action. It was the final nail in the coffin. More relatives blocked them. Some even called them out directly. 5 more family members, including an uncle who had previously tried to stay neutral, cut them off completely. But my parents still weren't done. They started directly messaging my wedding guests. Random people I hadn't spoken to in months were suddenly reaching out with screenshots. The messages were desperate. Please, just tell him to talk to us. We just want one last chance to make things right. He doesn't understand how much he's hurting us. One guest who barely knew them responded with, "You need to stop. This is harassment." They kept pushing until people started reporting them. Within days, their Facebook account was suspended for harassment. That should have been the end of it. But they came back with fake accounts. New profiles started appearing out of nowhere. No profile pictures, random names, but the messages were the same. Friend requests to me and Sarah. Weird vague messages like, "Please, let's talk. We will always love you." Some even went after my friends. At that point, we were done playing games. We had every single fake account reported and blocked. Then came the final attempt. An unmarked letter. It was left in our mailbox. No return address. Just a single envelope. Inside was one page. The only thing written, "Meet us before it's too late." I didn't even hesitate. I took the letter, shredded it, and threw it away without reading the rest. There was nothing left to say. The final court date was coming up, and they were running out of chances before facing real consequences. The final court date arrived faster than I expected. After months of harassment, social media meltdowns, fake accounts, workplace sabotage attempts, and even a home invasion stunt, my parents were finally facing real legal consequences. Sarah and I sat in the courtroom, watching as they shuffled in. My mother looked like she hadn't slept in days, her usual dramatics toned down for once. My father kept his usual cold, disappointed stare, probably expecting me to break down or beg for forgiveness. Not happening. The judge wasted no time. After reviewing every single violation, he ruled in our favor, a permanent restraining order. No more contact. No more fake accounts. No more showing up at our home, our jobs, or family events. And if they violated it, immediate jail time. No warnings. No second chances. That's when my mother snapped. She sobbed loudly, grabbing onto my father's sleeve like she was going to collapse. "How could you do this to us?" The judge ignored her. She switched tactics. "We just wanted our son back." Nothing. Then my father finally spoke. "You're a disgrace." Flat, cold, angry. It didn't affect me. Not anymore. The judge didn't care about their theatrics. He gave them one last warning. If they violated this order even once, they'd face immediate arrest. Their lawyer tried to fight it. They filed an appeal. It was denied. That was it. Game over. The last family fallout. The court ruling spread fast. Relatives who had still been on the fence finally made their decision. At least 10 more cut them off completely. Their only remaining supporters were a handful of enablers, distant relatives and online strangers who still believed their sob stories. The family was done with them, completely isolated. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected update. My parents had sold their house. No one knew where they moved. Some assumed it was to escape the embarrassment. Others thought they were looking for a fresh group of people to manipulate. But I didn't care. They were gone. The final attempt at manipulation. One last message. Not from them. From the cousin who leaked my address. A weak attempt at an apology. "I was tricked. I didn't mean to put you in danger." Blocked. No second chances. True freedom for the first time in months. Sarah and I finally had peace. No more messages. No more legal battles. No more looking over our shoulders. So we did what we should have done months ago. We booked our real honeymoon. 2 weeks. No distractions. Just us. And this time, no one knew where we were going. The ultimate ironic ending months later. I got one last update. My parents showed up at a distant family gathering. They tried to spin another sob story, tried to get sympathy. Someone called them out. It turned into a screaming match. And then, they were kicked out by their own family. No one bought their victim act anymore. They had burned every bridge. True peace at last. That was the last time I ever heard about them. No more letters, no more dramatic posts, nothing. They were irrelevant, and for the first time in my entire life I was free. I'm a 26-year-old guy, and for the past year I've been sending money to my parents every month. They're in their early 50s, and the story they've been telling me is that they're struggling with bills. My dad lost his job, and my mom has some sort of autoimmune disorder that makes it hard for her to work. They've always been proud, so when they first asked for help, I didn't even hesitate. Of course I'd help them out. I mean, they're my parents. But now, after more than a year, I'm starting to see things that don't add up. It started small. I've been working 2 jobs, really trying to scrape together whatever I can, even canceled a vacation I'd been looking forward to for months. I thought this was temporary just until they got back on their feet. But recently, things haven't been sitting right with me. My dad mentioned in passing that he's still golfing every week, something he's been doing for years. I brushed it off at first, but then my mom started talking about some expensive home decor she was eyeing. That's when I started getting suspicious. How are they struggling to pay rent but still have money for hobbies and fancy things? It really hit me when I overheard them during a visit. They were in the kitchen, and I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone. I wasn't eavesdropping or anything, but their conversation caught my attention. They were talking about getting new furniture. New furniture? The same people who have been telling me they're barely scraping by? My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything at the time, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next time I sent money, I decided to ask them about it. Just something casual like, hey, how's the budget looking? I want to make sure I'm helping enough. My dad laughed it off, saying they deserve a treat every now and then, even in tough times. I wanted to push back, but I felt weird questioning them. They're my parents, shouldn't I trust them? I talked to one of my friends about it, and she was the first one to plant the idea that maybe, just maybe, my parents weren't being completely honest with me. She suggested that they might be manipulating me. At first, I couldn't believe it. Who does that to their own kid? But the more I thought about it, the more things started to click. My parents never talked about how they were trying to fix their situation. They never mentioned looking into government assistance or getting a part-time job. It was just me, sending money month after month. To make things worse, my parents started asking for more. Every month, it was something new, an extra 100 here for groceries, another couple hundred there for utilities. I'm not swimming in money myself. I've got savings, but it's been shrinking fast, and I'm starting to worry about my own future. I want to buy a house someday, have an emergency fund, but with how things are going, that's starting to look impossible. Then there's my older brother. He's 32 and has flat out refused to help them financially. He says they're fine. I've always been closer to our parents, so I didn't think much of his stance before, but now I'm starting to wonder. Does he know something I don't? He's always been more skeptical, not as trusting, but I just can't bring myself to think that they'd lie to me. Still, he doesn't seem worried about them at all, and that's sticking with me. A few weeks ago, I visited my parents like usual. I wasn't looking for anything, but I saw it. Right there on the kitchen counter was a bank statement. I couldn't help myself. I took a quick look. The balance was way higher than what I'd expected from people who are supposedly broke. I didn't confront them about it at the time, but now I can't stop thinking about it. If they're sitting on money, why do they need mine? I'm stuck in this weird place of not knowing what's real anymore. I feel like I should trust my parents, but these little things keep piling up. Every time I send money now, I feel sick to my stomach, like I'm being played. I don't know what to do. Should I call them out on it? Ask my brother for more details? Or am I just being paranoid? It's getting to the point where I can't ignore it anymore. And now, it's not just about the money. It's about trust. I thought I knew my parents, but now I'm not so sure. Things don't add up, and I feel like I'm being kept in the dark. Something's going on, and I need to figure out what it is before this whole situation gets even worse. But I also don't want to destroy our relationship over a misunderstanding. I'm just hoping I'm wrong, but deep down I don't think I am. This is just the beginning, and I have a feeling things are about to get a lot more complicated. Update 1. After everything I'd seen and heard, I knew I couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. I had to confront my parents and figure out what was really going on with their finances. It wasn't easy to work up the nerve, but I decided the best way to get to the truth was to sit them down for an honest conversation. So, the next time I visited, I asked if we could talk. I tried to keep it casual, saying I just wanted to make sure I was helping out where they needed it most. Right away, I could tell something was off. My mom looked surprised, and my dad seemed uncomfortable. They didn't exactly jump at the chance to explain things. Instead, they seemed a bit defensive, like I was accusing them of something. I asked about their expenses. Where was the money I'd been sending going? How much were they really paying for rent, utilities, groceries, and those medical bills they'd been talking about? At first, they kind of danced around the questions, giving me vague answers. My dad mentioned some bills in passing, and my mom just nodded along. Nothing specific, nothing I could pin down. It was all too blurry. That's when I realized I wasn't going to get the truth easily. I pressed harder, asking them to be more clear about what exactly they were spending money on. They got flustered, and it almost felt like they were trying to change the subject, bringing up other things like how tough things have been for them lately. But they weren't giving me any real numbers or details. I left the conversation feeling more confused than ever. Something was definitely not adding up. I decided to reach out to a family friend I'd known for years, hoping they might have some insight. We were catching up over coffee, and I casually brought up how my parents had been struggling with money. That's when the friend dropped a bombshell. Apparently, my parents were members of a local social club, and not just any club, one with a hefty annual fee. The kind of place where people go for dinner, drinks, and networking. That hit me like a ton of bricks. How could they afford something like that when they were supposedly struggling to pay their basic bills? Now, I was feeling all sorts of things, mainly confusion and guilt. I didn't want to believe my parents could be lying to me. After all, what if they really were in need? I didn't want to abandon them in their time of trouble. But then again, how could they justify spending money on a social club if they were truly in financial trouble? I thought maybe my brother could help shed some light on things, so I gave him a call. I expected him to brush me off like usual, but instead he was furious. He went off saying that our parents had been pulling this scheme for years. According to him, they've always been good at making people feel sorry for them, playing the victim card whenever they needed money. I didn't want to believe him, but the pieces were starting to come together. A couple of weeks later, I visited my parents again. I wasn't planning on snooping, but while I was there, I noticed some brand new electronics in their living room, a high-end TV and a fancy sound system. I couldn't hold back any longer. I asked them outright how they were affording all this stuff when they were supposedly struggling to pay their bills. My dad shrugged it off, saying they got the electronics on sale and that they've been cutting back in other areas. My mom jumped in, saying they were doing their best to be frugal, but again, they didn't offer any real explanations. I was getting more frustrated by the minute. When I pushed a little more, they turned it around on me. They accused me of being selfish for questioning them, saying that I should be helping out my family without expecting anything in return. That hit hard. For a second, I wondered if maybe I was the one in the wrong. Was I being too harsh? Was it selfish of me to question their spending when they've been going through a rough time? But then I remembered the social club, the new electronics, the vague answers. Something still didn't feel right. On the advice of a friend, I decided to start digging. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I wanted to see if there were any signs of financial struggle, like past due bills or medical payments. What I found instead was more of the same, nothing that indicated they were in serious trouble. No overdue bills, no final notices from creditors, nothing. I went back to my brother and told him what I'd found, or more accurately, what I hadn't found. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he repeated that they'd been doing this for years, telling people they were in financial trouble to get sympathy and money. According to him, they'd pulled this act on other family members before, though not to the same extent they had with me. He warned me that if I kept sending them money, I'd just be enabling their behavior. That was the breaking point for me. I was angry, confused, and overwhelmed all at once. How could my own parents be lying to me, manipulating me for over a year? And yet, I still felt guilty, like I was somehow betraying them by doubting their word. Over the next few weeks, I started quietly gathering more information, paying attention to what they were buying and asking subtle questions about their expenses. I even talked to a few other family members, trying to get a clearer picture. The more I learned, the more it seemed like my parents were living a much more comfortable life than they'd led me to believe. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Something was definitely wrong, and I knew I had to make a decision soon. Update 2. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to confront my parents with everything I'd gathered. All the vague answers, the expensive electronics, the social club membership. It was time to lay it all out on the table. I had spent weeks collecting every piece of evidence I could, and I finally felt ready to have the conversation I'd been dreading. One Sunday afternoon, I went to their house. I hadn't told them I was coming for a serious talk, but they could probably sense something was different from my tone. We sat in the living room, and I started by asking again about their finances. Like clockwork, they got defensive. My mom looked confused, and my dad's usual calm demeanor was starting to crack. I wasn't going to let them dodge the questions this time. I pulled out the bank statement I had seen on their counter and asked them to explain the balance. At first, they tried to laugh it off. My dad said I must have misunderstood and that they were barely scraping by. I didn't let up. I pointed out their social club membership, the new electronics, and all the little things I'd been noticing over the past few months. That's when the mood shifted. My dad's face went red, and he looked at my mom like they were silently debating who was going to talk first. She started saying something about how they deserved a few nice things despite their hardships, but I wasn't buying it. I pressed harder, asking about their real expenses. I wanted to know how much they were spending on rent, utilities, groceries, and these medical bills they'd been talking about for over a year. Finally, my dad broke down. He admitted they hadn't been completely honest with me. They'd been using the money I'd sent for extras, not for essentials. He tried to justify it by saying they didn't want to lose face with their friends and neighbors. Apparently, keeping up appearances was more important to them than being honest with me. He said they didn't want anyone to think they were struggling, so they kept living their lives like nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs and struggling to make ends meet, thinking I was helping them survive. My mom jumped in, insisting that they still needed my help. She claimed the medical bills were piling up, but when I asked to see them, she became evasive. That's when I knew for sure something was really wrong. The more I pressed for details, the more she dodged the questions. Finally, she broke down into tears, saying she never thought her own son would turn against her like this. It felt like a punch to the gut. I could see the manipulation happening right in front of me, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. My dad eventually admitted they'd been sitting on a decent amount of savings this whole time. They claimed it was for their retirement, but I couldn't understand why they would let me struggle financially while they kept their own money untouched. At that moment, everything hit me. I'd been working myself to the bone, giving up my own plans and dreams, while my parents had been using my money to fund their luxuries. I felt betrayed. I stood up, furious, and told them I wouldn't be giving them another dime until they came clean about everything. No more lies. No more manipulation. If they needed help, they could be honest, but I wasn't going to enable them anymore. I left the house, not knowing what to do next. My mind was racing and I didn't want to make any rash decisions, so I turned to Reddit, hoping for some advice. I posted everything, how I'd been supporting my parents, the lies I'd uncovered, and the confrontation. The responses flooded in. Strangers from all over the world were telling me what I didn't want to admit. My parents had been manipulating me, and I needed to set firm boundaries. After the confrontation, my phone started blowing up. My parents were texting and calling, accusing me of turning the family against them by airing our private business online. They told me I was ungrateful for everything they'd done for me growing up, and that I didn't understand what it meant to help your family in tough times. But the thing is, I had been helping, and I was more than willing to continue helping if they had been honest with me. I ignored their calls and texts, knowing that I needed time to process everything. A few days later, my brother called. I hadn't expected much from him, given how distant he'd been about the whole situation, but this time was different. He told me he was glad I had finally seen the truth. He admitted that he'd tried to warn me, but he understood why I hadn't believed him at first. He said he'd support my decision to cut off the financial support until our parents were honest with us both. Now I'm left wondering if I should go no contact with them altogether. The trust between us has been shattered, and I don't know if it can be repaired. On one hand, they're still my parents, and a part of me wants to believe they can change. But on the other hand, I can't keep letting them take advantage of me. For now, I've cut off the financial support and made it clear that I won't be sending them any more money until they start being transparent about their situation. I'm still figuring out where to go from here. I don't know if our relationship can ever go back to what it was, but at least now I'm not blindly sending them money without knowing the full story. I guess only time will tell if they're willing to be honest and make things right. Update 3. After the heated confrontation with my parents, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. It was clear they had been taking advantage of me, and I needed space to figure things out. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I blocked them on everything. I didn't just cut off the money, I cut off all contact. I blocked their numbers, emails, and even unfriended them on social media. It wasn't an easy decision, but after everything that had happened, it felt necessary. For a few days, things were quiet. I thought maybe they'd give me space and think about what they'd done. But then, the emails and letters started. I had forgotten that I hadn't blocked their email addresses on my work email, so they found a way to get through. The first message came from my mom. It was the same manipulative tone I had started to recognize. She painted herself as the victim, saying I was abandoning my family in their time of need. She claimed her health was getting worse because of the stress I'd caused, which only made me feel more guilty. I could feel the emotional manipulation dripping from every sentence. A few days later, the letters started arriving in the mail. My dad's tone was much more aggressive. He accused me of being ungrateful and said if I didn't resume sending them money, they'd cut me out of their will. It was like a switch had flipped from them, begging for help to them threatening me. The whole thing left me reeling, but I didn't respond. I stuck to my decision to go no contact. My brother and I had been talking more after the confrontation. He reassured me that I wasn't overreacting. He reminded me that our parents had been manipulating us for years. He'd set boundaries with them a long time ago, and it was time I did the same. Still, it was hard. The guilt was overwhelming, and I wondered if I was being too harsh. What if my mom's health really was getting worse? What if I was making things harder on them than they deserved? I needed help sorting through everything, so I decided to start therapy. I had never been before, but I figured I needed an outside perspective on all of this. My therapist was great. She helped me see that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, especially when my parents had been exploiting me for so long. She reminded me that I wasn't responsible for their financial decisions or their well-being, especially not when they had been hiding money from me while making me work 2 jobs to support them. The therapy sessions helped me work through a lot of the guilt, but then things took a turn. A family friend reached out, completely out of the blue. They said my parents had been telling people that I had abandoned them and cut them off during their time of need. The same old story. I explained the situation to the family friend, but it was clear my parents had been spreading lies about me to anyone who would listen. That hurt more than I expected. It was bad enough that they'd manipulated me for money, but now they were trying to turn the family against me too. I decided to post an update on Reddit just to see if anyone else had been through something similar. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of family manipulation and abuse. They told me I had done the right thing by going no contact and reminded me that emotional manipulation is just as harmful as any other form of abuse. That support meant a lot, especially during a time when I was second-guessing everything. But the letters kept coming. My dad's latest one was even more aggressive than before. He threatened to disown me if I didn't start sending them money again. The funny thing is, I wasn't even worried about being cut out of their will anymore. If anything, it was just more proof that they were trying to control me. That's when I started wondering just how deep their lies went. I had already caught them in so many, and now I was curious about what else they might have been hiding. On a whim, I started looking into financial investigators. I figured if my parents had been hiding their real financial situation for this long, there was probably more I didn't know about. I hadn't hired anyone yet, but it was something I was seriously considering. During another call with my brother, he dropped a bombshell. Years ago, our parents had pulled a similar stunt with him. They'd asked him for money, claiming they were in financial trouble, but he found out they were sitting on a sizable savings account the whole time. He didn't tell me this before because he didn't want to sway my opinion too much, but now that I had seen it for myself, he felt like it was time to share. In therapy, I started to realize just how much of my life had revolved around seeking my parents' approval. I'd always wanted to be the good son, the one who helped out when things got tough. But in reality, I'd been enabling their bad decisions by constantly giving in to their demands. Every time I sent them money, I was helping them live a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, and they had no reason to change because I was always there to bail them out. It wasn't easy, but I finally came to terms with the fact that their financial struggles were largely self-inflicted. They weren't using my money to cover necessities, they were using it to avoid dipping into their own savings. That realization gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't had before. Moving forward, I knew any relationship with my parents would have to be on my terms. There would be no more financial support unless they were completely honest and transparent about their situation. If they couldn't do that, then I'd have no problem staying no contact. I was done being manipulated, and I was finally starting to take control of my own life again. Update 4. Things escalated quickly after I cut off contact with my parents. At first there was silence, but it didn't take long for them to strike back. I started hearing from extended family members, people who I hadn't spoken to in months, even years. My aunt was the first to call. She didn't waste any time scolding me for abandoning my parents. According to her, they'd been telling everyone that I had turned my back on them during their greatest time of need, leaving them financially ruined and heartbroken. I knew immediately that my parents had ramped up their smear campaign, but I stayed calm. I told my aunt the full story, from the lies about their finances to the manipulation I'd uncovered. I even mentioned the luxury purchases and the money they were hiding. When she heard all that, she went quiet. She didn't seem to know what to say. After a few awkward moments, she told me she didn't want to get involved in family drama and ended the conversation. I wasn't surprised. Most of my extended family had always been more interested in avoiding conflict than actually dealing with the truth. But it still stung that my parents were willing to drag my name through the mud, especially to people who didn't know the full story. Meanwhile, my brother, who had been so supportive before, suddenly went silent. I couldn't get him on the phone, and when I did finally get a hold of him, he seemed distant. He brushed off my concerns, saying he didn't want to talk about our parents. I started to wonder if they had gotten to him too. Maybe they were pressuring him, playing the same manipulative games they had with me. It was frustrating, but I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I decided to hire a financial investigator. I needed to know exactly what my parents were hiding. If they'd lied about their savings, who knows what else they'd been up to. The investigator started digging, and after a few weeks, the results were even worse than I expected. Not only did my parents have a healthy savings account, but they also owned several real estate investments. They weren't just comfortable, they were well off. They'd been sitting on all of this while letting me drain my own finances to support them. But the bombshell was still to come. The investigator found evidence of shady financial dealings, including a failed business venture that they had kept hidden. It was clear they had been mismanaging their money for years and were using my support as a way to avoid facing the consequences of their bad decisions. I couldn't believe it. They had lied to me, manipulated me, and let me sacrifice my own financial stability, all while hiding the truth about their situation. Armed with the investigator's report, I sent them one final email. I laid everything out, the savings, the real estate, the business deals. I demanded an explanation, though deep down I knew they wouldn't give me one. For the first time since this whole thing started, they went silent. No emails, no calls, no letters. Just nothing. It was like they had finally been caught and didn't know how to respond. A part of me felt relief, but another part of me felt a deep sadness. This wasn't how I imagined my relationship with my parents would end, but there it was. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I posted an update on Reddit, sharing everything I'd learned. The post went viral almost immediately. People were shocked by the lengths my parents had gone to manipulate me. Comments poured in, with users offering support and calling out the toxic behavior. Many shared their own experiences with manipulative family members, and it was comforting to know I wasn't alone in this. The fallout from the investigation didn't stop there. Some of my extended family members started distancing themselves from my parents after learning the truth. Others, however, weren't so understanding. They accused me of airing dirty laundry and said that no matter what had happened, I shouldn't have shared the details publicly. I knew they were just trying to avoid the drama, but it was frustrating to see people more concerned about keeping up appearances than acknowledging the truth. Then, out of the blue, my brother reached out. He apologized for going quiet and admitted that our parents had been pressuring him too. He hadn't known how to handle it and had needed time to figure things out. He promised to support me moving forward, and while I appreciated the apology, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us wouldn't be the same for a while. As for my parents, I've decided that any future contact with them will be on my terms. I'm open to reconciliation, but only if they're willing to be honest and take accountability for what they've done. I won't let them manipulate me anymore, and I won't let them use guilt or emotional blackmail to get what they want. It's a strange place to be in, mourning the relationship I thought I had with my parents while trying to navigate what our relationship will look like moving forward, if there even is one. But for now, I'm focusing on myself. I'm setting boundaries and making sure that, whatever happens, I won't fall back into the same patterns of manipulation. The truth is out, and while it's painful, it's also freeing. I'm no longer in the dark about what's been going on, and I'm finally taking control of my own life. It's not the ending I wanted, but it's the one I needed. Update 5. A few months after I went no contact with my parents, things started to feel lighter. No more constant phone calls asking for money. No more guilt-tripping emails. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could actually focus on myself. Therapy was helping too. My therapist really helped me work through the guilt and emotional scars my parents had left behind. It wasn't easy, but I was starting to make peace with the fact that not all family relationships can be saved. But of course, just when I thought things were finally settling down, my brother called me out of the blue. He told me our mom had a health scare and was in the hospital. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. He didn't go into too many details, but he asked if I wanted to visit. I didn't answer right away. My mind was spinning. On one hand, I didn't want to get sucked back into the toxic dynamic. On the other, she's still my mom, and the thought of not seeing her when she might really need me weighed heavily on me. I brought it up in therapy, and my therapist gave me some much-needed perspective. She reminded me to prioritize my emotional well-being and that I should only visit if I truly felt it was in my best interest, not out of guilt or obligation. That really stuck with me. I realized I didn't have to visit, and if I did, it would be on my terms. Then, out of nowhere, my dad reached out. After months of silence, he sent me an email saying they needed to talk and that they missed me. It felt like a sudden shift, and I couldn't help but be skeptical. Was this genuine, or was it another manipulation tactic? I wasn't sure, but I knew that if I was going to consider meeting with them, it had to be on my terms. I took my time thinking about it. Eventually, I agreed to a family meeting, but only in a public place and with my brother there for support. I needed to feel safe and in control, especially after everything that had happened. The day of the meeting came, and we met at a small cafe. It was awkward at first, like we were all waiting for someone else to speak. My parents looked different, older, more tired. Maybe it was the months of silence, or maybe it was just the weight of everything finally catching up with them. After a while, my dad spoke up. He apologized. For the first time, they both admitted they had been wrong. They admitted to deceiving me about their finances and acknowledged that what they'd done wasn't fair. They said they wanted to rebuild trust. It sounded sincere, but I couldn't help but feel cautious. After so many lies and manipulations, it was hard to believe this was a true change of heart. Still, I appreciated the fact that they were at least acknowledging their actions. I told them I wasn't ready to trust them again, not fully. I explained that while I appreciated the apology, things couldn't go back to the way they were. I laid out strict boundaries, no more financial support, period. Transparency would be non-negotiable moving forward, and I wasn't going to tolerate any more manipulation. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would be on these terms. Surprisingly, they agreed. My mom even said she understood why I didn't trust them, and that they wanted to make things right. I didn't know how to feel about it at the time. Part of me was cautiously optimistic. Maybe this was the beginning of something better. But another part of me was still on guard. I wasn't sure if they could truly change, or if this was just another phase in their cycle of manipulation. After the meeting, I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lot of uncertainty. I knew I'd have to keep my guard up and see how things played out over time. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight, and I wasn't going to let my guard down just because they'd apologized. In the meantime, I continued focusing on healing myself. Therapy had taught me a lot about boundaries, something I never really had with my parents before. I realized it was okay to prioritize my own well-being, even if it meant keeping some distance from them. I'd always believed that family came first, but now I knew that didn't mean sacrificing my own mental and emotional health to maintain a relationship with people who had repeatedly hurt me. A few weeks later, I posted one last update on Reddit. I shared everything that had happened, the apology, the boundaries I'd set, and how things were still complicated, but I finally felt like I was in control of my own life. The response was overwhelming, with people telling me how strong I was for setting those boundaries and how important it was to protect my own peace. Now, I'm still navigating what my relationship with my parents will look like. We're not exactly close, but we're not completely estranged either. I'm taking things one step at a time, and I'm making sure to keep those boundaries firm. They've respected them so far, but only time will tell if that continues. For now, I feel like I'm in a better place. I'm finally in control of my life and my choices. My relationship with my parents may never be perfect, but I've learned that it doesn't have to be. The most important thing is that I'm prioritizing myself, and that's something I've never really done before. I'm grateful for the support I've received, both from Reddit and from the people in my life who've helped me get through this. While I don't know what the future holds for me and my parents, I know one thing for sure: I won't let them control my life again.